Good morning and welcome to the Adult Bible Study offered by St. Cloud Presbyterian Church. The title of today's lesson is Healed by Faith, and we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 to 26. And if you'd like to read ahead for next week, our scripture passage for that week is going to be Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. One of the figures of the 20th century who lived their lives before the eyes of the world, the one who probably seemed to be the most at peace with himself and with others, was Mahatma Gandhi. He seemed to be a very image of tranquility. Well, 15 years before his death in 1948, he wrote this: "I must tell you in all humility that Hinduism, as I know it, entirely satisfies my soul. It fills my whole being, and I find solace in the Bhagavad and the Upanishad that I miss even in the Sermon on the Mount." But just before his death, he wrote this: "My days are numbered. I'm not likely to live very long, perhaps a year or a little longer. For the first time in 50 years, I find myself in a slough of despond." And at that point, Hinduism couldn't help him. Even the very tranquil Gandhi became despondent when he had to face the reality of his own mortality. He had to admit that his man-made religion couldn't offer him any comfort at all when he was faced with his own mortality. Right after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, ran the country. In fact, Vice President Andrew Johnson was such a weak person that Stanton continued to run things even after Johnson had been sworn in as president. Throughout the night, as Lincoln lay dying, Stanton controlled himself with superhuman effort because he had a tremendous fear of death. In 1833, a young girl in Stanton's boarding house had died of cholera, and she was buried immediately after she died. Well, that evening, Stanton took a shovel and dug her up. He was convinced that she couldn't be dead because she had served him lunch that day. 8 years later, in 1841, Stanton's daughter Lucy died, and after the funeral, he had her dug up, and he kept her coffin in his bedroom for 2 years. After his wife died in 1844, he would dress and redress her in different clothes, and he would often walk around the house asking where Mary was. Stanton just refused to recognize the fact that people die. But cemeteries have been a constant reminder of our mortality throughout history. Fact is, we live in a dying world. Ever since the fall, the world has been cursed, and that curse is the source of all of our pain and tears. Most of us can recite a long list of people that we know who have suffered some great tragedy in their lives. Every one of us has suffered the loss of a loved one. Every one of us has been affected by the breakup of a family as a result of a divorce. We all know people who have suffered through long bouts with illness. When Mary came out to meet Jesus on the road after the death of her brother Lazarus, John reports that she was crying, and people who came with her were also crying. Jesus was so moved by this that he began to cry himself. Now, he wasn't crying because Lazarus was dead. After all, he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead in a few minutes. But in the infinity of his mind, he could envision the pain and suffering that sin has caused mankind throughout human history. Sin was not God's purpose for mankind. Everything in the world was created to be a blessing to mankind. But mankind's sin has warped the world in a curse wrapped the world in a curse instead of a blessing. But there will come a day when sin will have run its course and it will be destroyed forever. John wrote, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." The Old Testament prophets had predicted that the Messiah would have the power to bring back wholeness to life. Well, when Jesus came into the world, he demonstrated that power, and the final fulfillment of those prophecies is still somewhere off in the future. But while Jesus was here on earth, he fully proved that he was the Messiah by having the ability to fulfill those prophecies. He virtually banished disease from Israel. He changed water into wine. He fed thousands of people with a few loaves of bread and a few fish. He calmed storms, he cast out demons, he forgave sins, and he raised people from the dead. This was just a sample of what he'll do when he establishes his kingdom. When John the Baptist was in prison facing death, he sent his disciples to ask if Jesus was really the Messiah. And Jesus told him, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the good news preached to them." The miracle that Jesus performed were the verification of his divine power. And that's the power that he will reveal someday when he reverses the curse that currently covers this earth. You see, even though Jesus had great compassion for the suffering people who came to him, he didn't heal them for their own sake. He performed those miracles in order to fulfill prophecy and to demonstrate his deity. In this way, he established his credentials as the Messiah for the Old Testament prophets had written about. The Canadian scientist G.B. Hardy once said, "When I looked at religion, I said, I have two questions. One, has anybody ever conquered death? And two, if they have, did they make a way for me to conquer death? I checked the tomb of Buddha, and it was occupied. I checked the tomb of Confucius, and it was occupied. And I checked the tomb of Muhammad, and it was occupied. And I came to the tomb of Jesus, and it was empty. I said, there is one who conquered death. And I asked the second question, did he make a way for me to do it? And I opened the Bible and discovered that he said, because I live, you shall live also." That is the supreme two-part question that all of mankind faces. Has anyone ever conquered death? And if so, did he provide a way for others to conquer death too? These are the questions that are answered in our scripture passage for today. After a time of intensive ministry, Jesus took his disciples and they crossed the Sea of Galilee to the eastern shore. On the way, they encountered a storm, and Jesus stopped it with a word. This demonstrated his power over creation. It was another miracle that was performed in order to prove his deity, because the one who created nature is the only one who would have the power to control nature. In other words, only God could do that. When they finally arrived at the shore, they meet a man named Legion who lived in the cemetery at Gadara and was possessed by 2,000 demons. Well, Jesus cast the demons out of the man, but he allowed them to go into a herd of pigs that was nearby. People of that area were mostly Gentiles, and they were so frightened by what Jesus had done that they asked him to leave. Well, at that point, Jesus and his disciples returned to the western shore of the lake, and Mark tells us that a great crowd followed. Isn't that ironic? One crowd breathes a sigh of relief when he leaves, while at the same time another crowd eagerly awaits him to his arrival. Well, waiting in that crowd were two people who were especially anxious to see Jesus, and today's scripture passage tells us their story. According to Luke, there was a great crowd waiting for Jesus that day. If he landed in Capernaum, which he probably did, this is understandable because Jesus had already developed quite a reputation as a miracle worker among the people there. Well, he didn't get very far before the crowds cornered him. Mark says that he stayed on the beach. He may have even taught them from a boat like he had done on other occasions. Well, as Jesus was answering the questions of some of John the Baptist's disciples, a man named Jairus came up to him. Matthew refers to him as a ruler, but both Mark and Luke call him a ruler of the synagogue. He's much more than that. The Greek word that Matthew used to describe Jairus is archon. It means first in rank or power. In Hebrew, he was called the Rosh Knesset. He was the highest-ranking religious leader in Capernaum. Jairus was responsible for the total administration and operation of the synagogue in that city. He supervised the worship services and he oversaw the work of the other elders. This would include teaching, judging disputes, and other leadership duties. As the ranking member of the religious establishment in Capernaum, Jairus was probably a Pharisee. Now, among the Jewish leaders, there was a growing hostility toward Jesus and his ministry, and Jairus must have been fully aware that when he approached Jesus. He knew that at the very least he would be severely criticized by his peers, and he may have even lost his position at the synagogue. And there was even a good possibility that he would lose his life as a result of this. Even so, he didn't try to protect himself by going to Jesus at night like Nicodemus did, nor did he try to disguise who he was or what he wanted. Verse 18, it says that Jairus knelt before him. The Greek term is proskuneo. It was a term that was used to describe a dog licking his master's feet. Mark tells us that he actually fell on his face before Jesus. This was an act of worship on his part. Now, obviously, not all acts of reverence that were shown to Jesus were completely sincere, but everything that Jairus did would lead us to believe that this was not the case with him. For the big kahuna of the synagogue to bow down to Jesus would have been humiliating for him. It was very unlikely that he would have subjected himself to the ridicule of the other Jewish elders if it wasn't sincere. So whatever thoughts he may have entertained about the source of Jesus' power, he realized that Jesus was the only one who could offer any hope for his daughter's recovery. Nothing else mattered as he came to Jesus in utter desperation. Look at verse 18 again. Jairus says, "My daughter has died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live." We learn from Mark that Jairus' daughter was actually still alive when he approached Jesus, but shortly after that he must have received word that she was dead, but he still believed that Jesus could help her. Now both Mark and Luke tell us that Jairus' daughter was 12 years old, so why is that important? Well, according to Jewish custom, that meant that she was now a woman. The day after her 13th birthday, the day after his 13th birthday, a Jewish boy was considered to be a man, and the day after her 12th birthday, a Jewish girl was considered to be a woman. At that point, her family would begin seriously preparing for her marriage. The marriage process would generally take several years, so they would begin early. Even so, Mark says that Jairus refers to her as my little daughter. She may have been a woman in the eyes of society, but to Jairus, she was still his little girl, and her life was worth any price that he may have to pay to get Jesus to help. Jairus realized that the Jewish establishment had nothing at all to offer a father who was facing such a tragedy. He also realized that the only hope that his daughter had was found in a man who was being ridiculed by the same Jewish establishment. In fact, some of the Jewish leaders were even trying to kill him. Now, obviously, God has been working in this man's heart. His request shows that he has complete confidence that Jesus has the power to heal his daughter even after she had died. He says, "But come and lay your hand on her and she will live." There wasn't a hint of doubt in that request. Now, Jairus may have asked Jesus to lay his hands on her because he had seen Jesus do this when he had healed other people. So he swallows his pride and he puts his fear aside. He didn't care at all about what his neighbors, his family, or even his fellow religionists thought. Nothing was going to keep him from seeking Jesus' help. And the first thing that brought Jairus to Jesus was a deep need. It's not uncommon that some great tragedy will drive a person to Jesus. The person who has no needs in his life rarely has any hunger for God. This is why in witnessing you have to convince people that they need salvation before you can tell them that Jesus is the only way for them to attain salvation. A person who isn't convinced that the ship is sinking don't see a need to get into a lifeboat. In the same way, the person who fails to recognize his sin doesn't see any reason to be saved from it. Similarly, the person who recognizes his need but thinks that he can meet it through human resources doesn't see the need for a supernatural Lord to help him. Well, Jairus was already convinced that human resources would never save his daughter's life, and he was equally convinced that Jesus' power could do it. It was possible that he was reluctant to seek Jesus' help until it became obvious that his daughter was going to die without it, but he knew now that Jesus was his only hope. You see, Jairus didn't really come to Jesus with an entirely pure motive. In other words, he didn't come primarily to worship or to glorify Jesus. Instead, he came to ask Jesus to save his daughter's life and to relieve his own pain and suffering in the process. But he trusted Jesus for that help, and he found Jesus accessible. You see, the first thing that brought him to Jesus was his need. And the second thing that brought him to Jesus was his faith that Jesus could meet his need. In other words, he believed that Jesus had the power to do what he asked him to do. Even after he found out that his daughter had died, his faith did not waver. Jesus marveled at the faith of the centurion in Capernaum who came to him in chapter 8 asking him to cure his servant because he felt that Jesus could heal the servant with just a word. He even told Jesus, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word and my servant will be healed." Then Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, no one in Israel have I found such faith." Well, Jairus believed that it would only take a touch of Jesus' hand to raise his daughter from the dead. His faith even surpassed the faith of Martha, Lazarus' sister. She believed that if Jesus had arrived sooner, he could have healed her brother, but she gave up all hope when he died. Even after Jesus had said, "Your brother will rise again," she thought that it could only happen at the resurrection on the last day. With a faith that was great enough to believe that all it would take would be the touch of Jesus' hand to raise his daughter from the dead, it's amazing that Jairus didn't trust that Jesus could forgive his sins and raise him to spiritual life the same way that he raised his daughter to physical life. Now, I want you to notice that Jesus was not some sort of religious guru who had a staff of servants who did everything for him. And he didn't lock himself up in a monastery separated from the rest of the world waiting for them to come to him. And he wasn't surrounded by a bunch of flunkies that had to be gotten past before he could be seen. Even though he was the Son of God, he was accessible. He walked the streets of the cities. He visited the smallest villages. He talked with the greatest among men. And he reached out to the greatest outcasts of society. Rich or poor, healthy or sick, noble or slave, educated or uneducated, successful or deprived, young or old, male or female, Jew or Gentile, it didn't matter to Jesus. They all had access to him. Almost everywhere that Jesus went, he was surrounded by crowds of people. Now, this is a review of something that I talked about a few weeks ago, but it's worth repeating. There were three kinds of people in that crowd that followed Jesus. First, there was the critical and resentful religious leaders, and especially the self-righteous scribes and Pharisees. Second, there was the curious and uncommitted onlookers who were only there to see the show or to get what they could get from him. Unfortunately, these people make up the majority of most church congregations. And then there were the guilty, hurting, and desperate people who came to Jesus for help from sin, sickness, and tragedy. These are the people who came to Jesus with their deepest needs because they knew that he would listen to them and he cared about what happened to them. The creator of the universe, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, was never too busy to serve his creatures. Look at verse 19. And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciples. Now, not only was Jesus accessible to Jairus, he was available to Jairus. Jesus could have just as easily healed his daughter from where he was. I mean, after all, he'd done to the centurion servant. But in a demonstration of self-giving love, Jesus followed this grieving father to where his daughter's dead body was now lying. See, God is just as sensitive to the plea of an individual as he is to the needs of the multitude. Even today, God will sometimes lead his servants to do the same thing that he led his son to do that day. He has them temporarily lay aside a seemingly larger ministry in order to concentrate on the needs of one person. The Lord makes absolutely certain that he keeps the promise that he inspired John to write, "Whoever comes to me, I will never cast out." Well, as Jesus left the beach at Capernaum, Mark tells us that a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. Well, in verse 20, we meet a second person who was anxious to see Jesus that day. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. Like Jairus, this woman knew that Jesus was the only one who could help her. And just as Jairus' daughter had known 12 years of happiness, this poor woman had known 12 years of pain and suffering. At that time, medical science was really more superstition than anything else. And Mark wasn't interested in protecting the medical profession of his day. So he tells us that she had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. I think it's interesting to note that Luke, who was a physician, must have been concerned about his professional reputation because he simply says she could not be healed by anyone. Now, her condition created pain for her that went much deeper than just physical ailment. This woman's hemorrhage was probably caused by a tumor or a disease of the uterus. And according to the Old Testament law, her condition would have made her ceremonially unclean for at least the last 12 years. This would have placed severe restrictions on her religious and social life because her bleeding was continuous. So she couldn't be made ceremonially clean even for a short time. So she would have been just as outcast by society as a leper was. Now, this condition wasn't uncommon in those days. We know this because the Jewish Talmud gives 11 different cures for it. And among the prescribed remedies was to carry the ashes of an ostrich egg in a linen bag during the summer and a cotton bag in the winter. Another remedy involved carrying around a barley corn kernel that had been found in the dung of a white female donkey. I think medicine has come a long way since then. Now, Leviticus 15 says that any woman is to be considered unclean for 7 days beyond her monthly period. But during that time, anyone who touched her or anything that she touched was to be ceremonially unclean for the rest of the day. And this woman had lived with this for 12 years. For 12 years, she couldn't touch anyone, and they couldn't touch her or anything that she had touched. She was perpetually in a state of ceremonial uncleanness. She was excluded from the synagogue and the temple because if she touched anyone, they wouldn't be able to participate in the worship services. Even her interactions with her family had to be carried out from a distance, and this would include her husband if she was married. So here she is. In addition to her social and religious isolation, she's now flat broke because she spent every penny she had in a vain attempt to find a cure. Well, this woman works her way through the crowd, and she touches Jesus' cloak as he's walking by. Matthew and Luke tell us that what she touched was the fringe of his garment. The word fringe translates the Greek word kraspidon, and it means fringe or tassel. The Jews called that fringe tzitzit. According to biblical requirements, Jewish men were to put tassels on the corners of their garments, and each tassel was to hang from a blue cord. The threads and the tassels and the cords were all woven into a pattern that represented faithfulness and loyalty to the Word of God. Wherever a Jew went, those tassels were to remind him that he belonged to the Lord, and it was to be a witness to the world of that truth. Now, typical of their hypocrisy and religious pretense, the Pharisees made their tassels longer in order to show off their piety to the world. Much later on, the Jews who were being persecuted in Europe would sew their tassels to their underwear for the very opposite reason. They didn't want anyone to know that they were Jews. Modified forms of these tassels are still sewn on the prayer shawl known as a tallit of Orthodox Jews today. I have a tallit that has these tassels on it. It's a shame that we weren't meeting in person right now, or I could show them to you. Well, wearing the tallit can get in the way when you're trying to work. So many Jewish men will wear what looks like a small apron that has the tzitzit attached to it. Well, it was probably one of these tassels that the woman touched as Jesus passed, where she said to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I will be made well." A very godly man named Sir James Simpson was dying, and a friend said to him, "Well, James, soon you'll be able to rest on the bosom of Jesus." In this very humble way, he replied, "I don't know that I can quite do that, but I do think that I can take hold of his garment." Well, I wonder why this woman was being so sneaky about approaching Jesus. It comes out of the misogyny that was ingrained in the society of that day. First off, she was a woman and Jesus was a man. And in Jewish society, a woman was not to speak to a man unless he spoke to her first. And remember, anybody she touched was supposed to be ceremonially unclean, so she shouldn't have been there in the crowd that day in the first place. She probably figured that if she came to him openly, there was no way that Jesus would ever heal her. But her faith told her that he could heal her. She just didn't think that she was worthy enough for him to actually do it. But she felt that if she could just touch his clothing, she would be healed. Well, her confidence wasn't in vain. As soon as she touched the tassel of his coat, verse 22 says, Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. Notice that Jesus was speaking to her in past tense. He didn't say your faith will make you well. He said your faith has made you well. She was healed even before Jesus even spoke to her. Well, Jesus sensed that this touch was different from the touch of the crowd that was around him. So we see in Mark's account that he says, "Who touched me?" The disciples looked at him as though he were nuts. They say, "You've got to be kidding. There are hundreds of people pushing and shoving all around you, and you're wondering who touched you?" At that moment, Jesus sees the woman in the crowd, and she must have been terrified. She was a woman, and a ceremonially unclean woman at that. and she had dared to touch this very important teacher, and that would make him ceremonially unclean. So she's still shaking in fear. She came over and fell at his feet, probably fully expecting him to punish her for being so bold. But instead she hears, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." Jesus didn't care at all that the religious authorities thought that her touch had made him ceremonially unclean. And the chief Jewish authority of that city was walking right next to him. But Jesus has always been willing to touch and be touched by the untouchable. Throughout Jesus' earthly ministry, thousands of people came in contact with him, and hundreds of them talked with him and even touched him. But many of them were not touched by him. Throughout the history of the church, countless millions, including Mahatma Gandhi, that I mentioned earlier, have also come in close contact with Jesus, but they still haven't reached out in faith and touched him. Fact is, Jesus knows the difference between a person who approaches him out of some sort of religious curiosity or out of some desire for experiences, and the person who approaches him in desperation and genuine faith. This woman's expectations seem to have been almost superstitious. She may have thought that there was some sort of magical power in the clothing this miracle worker wore. People do the same thing today with all sorts of religious relics. They'll go to great lengths to touch a statue of some saint as if there was some power available in the material that statue was made of. They forget that that statue was made by human beings. A lot of faith healers, in return for a sizable donation, will send out prayer claws that they've touched and tell people that their prayers will be answered if they hold it while they pray. It's a wonder that God doesn't strike them dead right on the spot for thinking that they have so much power that a cloth that they've touched can guarantee that a person's prayers will be answered. And it's got to be the epitome of arrogance. Well, in this case, Jesus spoke to this woman very tenderly. He even called her daughter. Whatever else she may have had in her mind, her faith was genuine and it was acceptable to the Lord. All right, let me draw your attention back to verse 22 for a second. The common Greek word for healed was huies, and that is the word that Mark used in the account when Jesus said, "Be healed of your disease." But in all three of the gospel accounts of this woman's healing, what Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well," the word used is sozo. It literally means to save. And the word appears in the New Testament 110 times, and 92 times is translated save or salvation. You see, she actually approached Jesus looking for salvation. Well, I wonder why she did that. I thought she wanted Jesus to heal her. Now remember, at that time, it was felt that all disease was punishment for sins. So she felt that she needed to have her sins forgiven before she could ever be healed. Her reasoning may have been flawed, but she was right in thinking that her greater need was more spiritual than it was physical. Apparently this woman's faith was strong enough to grant her spiritual salvation too. Her physical healing only confirmed her spiritual healing. In the account of the 10 lepers who begged Jesus to heal them, Luke tells us that all 10 of them were cleansed. The Greek word is katharizo. Until the one who returned to glorify God and to thank Jesus, he said, "Your faith has made you well." It's the same word, sozo. In other words, there were 10 lepers cleansed that day, but only one of them obtained salvation. It's a real shame that most English translations don't make the distinction with those when they translate those words. Now, throughout the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, we read about many people who were healed completely apart from any faith or on their part, or on the part of any other person. Jesus healed people by his sovereign will. He would very often do it in response to faith, but faith wasn't always the condition for healing. The centurion servant was healed without ever coming into contact with Jesus. Obviously, Jairus' dead daughter wasn't able to demonstrate her faith. But no one is ever saved apart from faith. And that seems to be strong evidence to suggest that this woman had that type of faith that trusted Jesus for spiritual healing as well as physical healing. Now, there are two things that bring men and women to Jesus Christ. The first one is a deep felt personal need, and the second one is genuine faith. And it appears that this woman had both. Now, the fact that Jesus ministered to this outcast woman with the same vigor that he ministered to this religious leader shows us his divine impartiality. He was not offended when this woman took hold of his cloak with her unclean hands, even though he was working his way through a very demanding crowd as he was on his way to raise this young girl from her deathbed. Jesus didn't resent the fact that she temporarily took him away from what might seem to be a more important mission in order to seek help for herself. The fact is, no person ever interfered with Jesus' ministry, because the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And he just told a self-righteous Pharisee, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. He came to seek and to save sinners who knew that they were sinners. And these people have always been more likely to be poor and insignificant of the world. Paul reminded the Corinthians, for consider your calling, brothers, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards, not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are. The novelist Frederick Buechner wrote, who could have predicted that God would choose not Esau, the reliable and honest, but Jacob, the trickster and heel grabber, that he would put the finger of Noah, who hid the bottle, or of Moses, who was trying to beat the rap of Midian for braining a man in Egypt. And if it weren't for the honor of the thing, he just as soon let Aaron go back and face the music, or the prophets, who were a ragged lot, mad as hatters, most of them. Well, after quoting that passage in the book, their book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made, Paul Brand and Phil Yancey added this: the exception seems to be the rule. The first humans that God ever made went out and did the only thing that God ever asked them not to do. The man that God chose to head a new nation known as God's people tried to pawn his wife off as an unsuspecting Pharaoh, and the wife herself, when told of the ripe old age of 91 that God was ready to deliver the son that he had promised to her, broke into rasping laughter in the face of God. Rahab the harlot became revered for her great faith, and Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, went out of his way to break every proverb he had astutely composed. Even after Jesus came, the pattern continued. The two disciples that did the most to spread the word after his departure, John and Peter, were the two he had rebuked most often for petty squabbling and muddle-headedness. And the Apostle Paul, who wrote more books than any other Bible writer, was selected for the task while kicking up dust whirls from town to town, sniffing out Christians to torture. Jesus had nerve entrusting the high-minded ideals of love and unity and fellowship to this group. No wonder cynics have looked at the church and sighed, if that group of people is supposed to represent God, I'll quickly vote against him. Or as Nietzsche expressed it, his disciples will have to look more saved if I am to believe in their Savior. Isn't it wonderful that God is far more gracious than men are? God never excuses disobedience, unfaithfulness, or any other sin, but he will forgive every sin that is placed under the atoning death of his Son, Jesus Christ. Position, prestige, and possessions offer no advantage with him, and a lack of those things is not a disadvantage. Peter eventually learned this when he said, truly I understand that God shows no partiality. And Paul said, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and no female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. All right, move on to verse 23. It speaks highly of Jairus' faith that he kept quiet during the time that Jesus had stopped to speak to this woman. Even so, he was probably wishing that Jesus would hurry up. Well, even though the delay had brought great joy to this woman, it proved to be a disaster for Jairus' mission. Even as Jesus was still speaking to the woman, Mark tells us some people arrived from Jairus' house. The person who told Jairus that his daughter had died probably went back and told Jairus' family that Jairus was still asking Jesus to come and heal her. So they probably came to try to convince him that it was too late and she was dead. But they didn't have the same kind of faith that Jairus had. So they say to him, your daughter is dead, why trouble the teacher any further? To these people, time had run out. They knew that Jesus could heal illness, but they didn't consider the possibility that Jesus might be able to raise her from the dead. I mean, after all, only God could do that. So now they figured that all hope was lost and the girl was dead. There was nothing else to be done but bury the body. So why bother Jesus any further? Well, verse 18 told us that Jairus knew that his daughter was dead even before he approached Jesus. So maybe Jairus thought that they had already buried the body. I mean, after all, it was customary to bury the dead on the same day they died. So if that had happened, it was too late. There was nothing else that could be done. At this point, it would have been very easy for this grieving father to strike out at Jesus. Why did you stop and heal that woman? She had been sick for 12 years. She could have waited another hour. But now my daughter was buried before we could get there, and all because you didn't move faster. Don't we all do that? We blame God for the tragedies of our lives because we feel that He didn't act fast enough to prevent our loss. We forget what Paul said, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. We have to realize that God will sometimes call on us to suffer because it serves His purpose. We need to trust in the promise that everything that happens to us will work out for good for somebody, even if it is not us. If we remain faithful, our reward in heaven will be far greater than our loss here on earth. Well, why didn't Jesus wait until later to talk to this woman? I think that Jesus was delaying going to Jairus' house in order to heal this woman, purposely so that there would be no doubt in anybody's mind that this girl was dead. You see, in order to demonstrate His power over death, Jesus needed a dead person to raise, so it served His purpose for her to die. And He didn't want anyone to say that she wasn't really dead, but she was just in a coma. Well, Jesus offers Jairus' word of encouragement by reminding him to keep trusting Him. But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." Jairus had demonstrated his faith in Jesus' power up until now. So Jesus is just reminding him to keep on believing in spite of what these people were saying. After all, by healing that woman, Jesus had demonstrated His power again, and this time Jairus was an eyewitness. So he has even more proof that Jesus can save his daughter. Well, we go back to Mark to find out what happened next. And He allowed no one to follow Him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. At this point, Jesus dismisses the curious crowds. In fact, even 9 of His disciples He left behind. He may have done that so that they could help control the crowds until He had finished. He wasn't there to put on a show for them. He takes Peter, James, and John with Him. We're told later that Jairus was also allowed to come, and they go straight to Jairus' house. Look at verse 24. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion. We didn't know exactly how long Jairus' daughter had been dead, but apparently it was long enough for the professional mourners and the flute players to be called. You see, it was customary to bury the dead on the same day that the death occurred, or at least by the next day. So the mourners and flute players were on call at any moment. You see, funerals in most ancient cultures were nothing like they are today. They were not times of quiet whispers and soft music. In fact, the noisier the better. Jewish funerals of that day involved 3 prescribed methods of showing grief. The first one was tearing your clothes. The Talmud actually records 39 different rules for tearing your clothes at funerals. The clothing is to be torn while the mourner is standing. If the mourner is the deceased mother or father, the tear must be made directly over the heart. For anyone else, the tear near the heart is acceptable. The tear must be large enough to put your fist through, and it can only be re-sewn by large loose stitches for the first 30 days after the funeral. This allowed the person to be covered while still leaving the tear visible. For the sake of modesty, women were allowed to tear their undergarments and then wear them backwards. Modern Jews understand how expensive clothes are, so they'll pin a piece of torn cloth on their clothing. The second way to express grief was by hiring professional women mourners. They were called wailing women. They would sit around crying while they would very loudly wail the name of the deceased. They would also intermingle the names of other family members who had died in the past. The idea was that the sorrow would be intensified by reminders of their family members who had died. Even the poorest families were expected to hire at least one wailing woman when someone died. The third way to express grief was to hire professional musicians, and they were usually flute players. And like the wailing women, they would play very loud, and they didn't play songs. They played disconcerting sounds that were meant to reflect the emotional discord and confusion of grief. The Talmud said this: "The husband is bound to bury his dead wife, and to make lamentations and mourning for her, according to the custom of all countries. Also, the very poorest among the Israelites will not allow her less than 2 flutes and 1 wailing woman." Well, since Jairus was the head of the synagogue, he was no doubt a man of means. And as a man of means, there were many professional mourners at his house, and when Jesus and the disciples finally arrived there, look at verse 23. When Jesus came into the house, he says, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping," and they laughed at him. What Jesus says here is really more of a command than a request. He's really telling these professional mourners that they aren't needed so they can go home. Well, the mourners were really annoyed that Jesus would expect them to leave. I mean, after all, they were just following the long-established traditions set down by respected rabbis centuries earlier. What they were doing was not only proper, it was required. And how dare he even suggest that this girl was only sleeping? I mean, they were professionals. They knew death when they saw it. So they began to laugh at him. Now, the Greek word translated laughed in verse 24 is kathagalao. It means to laugh down at or to scorn. It was the laugh of someone who was gloating over someone else's stupidity. In other words, they are laughing at someone that they feel superior to. Now, the fact that they could turn their mourning into laughter so quickly gives away the fact that these mourners are being paid to act the way they did. Their tears did not reflect any real sorrow. The fact is, many professional mourners would collect their tears in a bottle to show prospective employers how good they were at crying. It also showed that they had no faith at all in Jesus' power to raise this girl from the dead. Now, Jesus wasn't inferring by what he said that the girl hadn't really died and was only asleep. He knew that she was dead, just as he knew that Lazarus was dead when he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." Jesus' disciples had misunderstood what he meant on that occasion too. They said, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover." So Jesus had to spell it out for him. He said, "Lazarus is dead." Now, after the professional mourners had been put out of the room, only Jesus, the girl's parents, and Jesus' 3 disciples remained. All right, look at verse 25. "But when the crowds had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and Mark tells us what he said, Talitha Komi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And verse 25 says, and the girl arose. Now, this wasn't some sort of magical spell. Jesus addressed the girl in Aramaic, which was her native language. He didn't need to use some magical incantation to bring her back to life. He just told her to get up. She got up. In Aramaic, Talitha is the feminine form of the word tale, which means lamb. So he says, little lamb, get up. And just so people will know that she's not just some sort of spirit, he tells them to give her something to eat. Well, the reaction of the people who were in the room was quite predictable. We go back to Mark's account again, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. Well, how would you react if you just witnessed someone that you knew for a fact was dead as a doorknob suddenly being brought back to life? Jesus has demonstrated that he has the power not only over sickness and sin, but over Satan and death as well. In Christ, there is no longer any reason at all to fear disease, demons, tragedy, or even death, because Jesus has won the victory over every one of man's enemies. As believers, and I hope that you all are, we can rejoice in dying because our Lord has conquered death. Even though we will never return to this life, we will be raised to a new life. An anonymous poet once wrote, no longer must the mourners weep, nor call departed children dead, for death is transformed into sleep, and every grave becomes a bed. When T.L. Moody was a young man, he was called on to preach his very first funeral sermon. He began to search through the scriptures to find some of the funeral sermons that Jesus had preached, but it wasn't long before he realized that Jesus never preached a funeral sermon. If you study the Gospels, you'll see that Jesus broke up every funeral that he ever went to by raising the dead person back to life. Whenever the dead hear his voice, they immediately come back to life. Arthur Brisbane described the funeral of a Christian this way. It's like a crowd of grieving caterpillars all wearing black suits, crawling along mourning and carrying the cocoon of their dead brother to its final resting place, where right above them flutters a beautiful butterfly who was looking down on them in disbelief. Death can strike God's people in unexpected, painful, and sometimes senseless ways. And Jesus doesn't promise to give us explanations for tragedies like that. Instead, he gives us the wonderful assurance that I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live.